Looks good.
Okay, thank you so much. So my name is Jill McDougall. I'm the Clinical Operations Manager at the Gene Therapy Program at the University of Pennsylvania. So I'm here today to talk a little bit about a study we're doing on the natural history of infantile and juvenile GM1 patients. So I know that this virtual conference setup is new to everybody, and I just appreciate the opportunity to be a part of it. So it's my understanding that most of you were able to attend some in-depth sessions about natural history studies and their purpose and their use in conjunction with clinical development. So I won't speak too much to that, but just sort of as a reminder, a natural history study collects data and health information over time to understand how a medical condition or disease develops. And this is especially important in rare diseases because it's hard to have kind of centralized data on these diseases to understand how they progress. So that said, for our GM1 natural history study, our objectives are really to build a robust data set that can be used in the future as comparator data for some of these clinical trials that are starting up, which is so exciting. And to provide supporting data for future clinical development programs in GM1. So we're hoping it'll just help researchers across the board gain a better understanding of the disease progression. And one thing I wanted to note here in particular is that we at GTP are very committed to sharing this data set with the wider research community once the study is completed. So we'll have a contracting process, but anybody from the scientific community, foundation or commercial entity that has a legitimate, interest in using the data, we're willing to share it, and we think that's important in this space especially. So here's just kind of an infographic showing where our current natural history study sites are. We're working actually to add a couple more here. But just to give you an idea of the spread of our study sites across the world, right now we have 3 sites that are initiated and open for enrollment. So Porto Alegre in Brazil, CHOP here in Philadelphia, and Great Ormond Street Hospital for Children in London are open for enrollment. However, given the current COVID-19 circumstances, things are slowed down kind of across the board research-wise. So in a couple of slides, I'll talk a little bit more in depth on what we're doing to sort of try and address that and keep things moving forward. So we wanted to share just briefly a little bit about study participation and how that would look for you, the families of the participants. So the first thing we kind of want everybody to know is that population-wise, anybody with a child diagnosed with infantile or juvenile GM1 can consider participating as long as the child isn't. So we really didn't want to have, exclusionary criteria or limit this in any way because we're hoping to gather the most robust data that we can. The study visits themselves will take place every 6 months over the course of 1 to 3 days, depending, how things go at the site. And we, as the study sponsor, will cover the costs for families to travel to whichever site is closest to you. So travel and accommodation costs will be covered. And then at those, we'll be looking at as part of this study are blood samples and other biosamples, imaging assessments, so an X-ray of the spine, and MRI or ultrasound of the brain and abdomen. And then there will be a number of functional assessments, which are similar to the ones your neurologist performs already, kind of looking at motor skill development, some neurocognitive assessments, things like that. And then a seizure diary and parent-reported quality of life measures that you'll report about your child's quality of life since the last study visit. And one thing to note here is some of the study procedures, in particular the MRI, may be considered more invasive. So just always, those things are optional, and we don't want anyone to feel that by participating in this study, they're obligated to do everything. That's not the case. So I think this is probably the slide we're all most interested in today. I mentioned earlier that we have 3 of our study sites up and running for enrollment, but once COVID-19 kind of happened, it shut down a lot of the site's activities. So IRBs aren't working quite as quickly. Anything non-essential is sort of slowed down. So I wanted to talk just briefly about how we're moving forward in light of these circumstances. So we're working to develop a protocol amendment and get it approved at the sites that will allow for remote and retrospective data collection as part of this study. So what that looks like for the remote piece, we'll be collecting data about your child from home rather than traveling to the study site for a visit. So questionnaires and video recordings, video chats with the study staff. Some of those assessments can be done via video. So things like that we can still, collect some data without you having to travel to the study sites. And the second piece is the retrospective data collection. So collecting data from your child's medical records from before they entered the study. And just kind of to clarify, in both cases, we'll be collecting the same data points that we planned to collect in the original protocol, just collecting it a different way. And we're thinking that this reduces travel burden on families while still honoring kind of the public health guidelines that we're all living with. And our hope is that implementing these things will help us keep moving the study forward, not just during the pandemic, but we think they're good ideas for afterwards too. And we think they'll help us continue gathering good data even once things open back up. So here we thought we'd share just a few of the more commonly asked questions that we get about our natural history study. So I won't read you, every word on this slide, but we'll go through them briefly. So the first one, does participating in this study exclude your child from future clinical trials? No, but keep in mind that if and when your child enrolls in a therapeutic trial, they'd stop participation in the natural history study, which is, it's a good thing. We're excited for all the trials opening, and it's an exciting time. And then kind of similarly, would your child have to stop treatment to participate in the study if he or she's already enrolled in a trial? So again, if they're participating in a treatment trial, we wouldn't include their information in the natural history study just because then it wouldn't be natural history data. The third one there, does participating in this study benefit my child in any way? So since there's no potential treatment offered as part of this study, there's not a direct benefit to your child or to you by participating, but we think that the data produced by this study will be really valuable to the community overall. So that's something to keep in mind. And then the last one here, would we have to keep track of things that happen outside of study visits? So yes, especially once we get that remote piece implemented. So for starters, you'll have this seizure diary where you record weekly or so kind of a summary of any seizure activity that you see in your child. And then once we get that remote data collection piece implemented, you'll work with the doctors to collect that data as well. So there's some activity required outside of the sites themselves. And then lastly here, we just wanted to include some suggestions for further reading if you haven't already read. This is just a list of guidance documents from the FDA that talk about natural history studies for rare diseases, how they can be used in the drug development process, and kind of addresses some of the common issues and questions that people see when working in this space. So again, thank you so much for having me. That kind of concludes my formal presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions that anyone may have for the last few minutes here.
Thank you, Jill. I'm not sure if you can see the Q&A, but there is a question that says, where can we enroll? Will someone be sending out a link or email?
So I'd encourage you to email our group at GTP, and we can point you towards the sites that may be closest to you. So I don't know if my contact information is shared as part of this, but I'm happy to send that along.
Okay, I think so. In the app, in the conference app, there is a link to speakers, and if your contact information is not available there, then I'm sure that NTSAD will be happy to provide it. I had another question just for those who may not have experienced an MRI before, what should the parents expect their child to have to do to have an MRI?
Sure. So depending kind of on the study site, it's an imaging procedure that at CHOP at least takes about half an hour to take imaging pictures of the child's brain and abdomen, look at things like spleen volume, brain volume. And in infants in particular, a lot of sites will use sedation, general anesthesia, so that the kid is still, and also so that they're not scared during the process when they're inside the MRI machine. So that's kind of why we consider it optional, because it's pretty far outside what you might see in a standard of care visit. So we make that optional.
Right. So they may be sedated, but basically they're just going to lie there and go through the MRI and then come out.
Right.
And then also, are there age restrictions for participation? This is a question from Merle Jackson.
Sure. Thanks for that. So we're not formally restricting age. We want to include as much data as we can, so there's no age restriction in the criteria, no.
Great. And another question from Ruben, when do you plan to have the first results, and how many patients are you targeting to enroll type 1 versus type 2?
Sure, thanks for that, Ruben. So the goal is to have 20 patients of each type, so 40 overall in the overall study. And I think for the first part of the question, it sort of remains to be seen how the COVID pandemic plays out. Timelines of when we'll have a data cut that we're ready to share, and when we consider that sort of concluded. So I can't really speak to that at this point, but again, I'm happy to converse via email if you want, and see what else we can. Yeah.
Fantastic. Let's see, one other question. Okay. There's a question about another company doing a remote natural history study and whether there is a collaboration between the two.
I'm not sure off the top of my head what that company, I mean, I'd have to know, I guess, what the company is, so I can't really speak to it, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that either, but it's an interesting idea. Let's see, one last question. How many visits should the family expect, and how often?
Sure. So the visits would be every 6 months for up to 3 years, unless a treatment trial is available that the child is going to participate in. So it ends up being 7 in total, maximum.
Fantastic. Well, that is wonderful, Jill. Any other questions from the panelists or from the attendees before we move on? Okay, thanks very much, Jill.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.